What's going on, everyone? So we are a ways into Sunday, the final day of weekend 3 for the planetary qualifier meta. And I'll say this, the meta has really solidified itself in what I think will remain consistent throughout the rest of set 3. And there is a clear number 1 and number 2 deck, followed by potentially you could say top 5. Like the 3, 4, and 5 are pretty close, but there is a very clear number 1, very clear number 2, and a pretty clear number 3. And well, if you haven't seen already, just from the one we're looking at, it's Han Yellow. It is the best deck in set 3, pretty much bar none. We were talking about Sabine, but as we've seen more and more Han Yellows, more and more planetary qualifiers, Han has really dominated in that area. So before we dive into some lists, talk about the meta, and talk about some crazy finishes, I'll say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and also have a TCG player link in the description down below for any of your Star Wars Unlimited card needs. And I will mention, I'll probably do less and less of these planetary qualifier reviews. I did the same thing with set 2. The first 3 weekends were a lot more exciting, and then anytime there's going to be like a weird thing that happens, maybe I'll come back and talk more about the planetary qualifiers. But I think as of now, there's going to be very few surprises. Well, there is one today that took down a planetary qualifier, but as we go further and further, I don't think there's going to be like, oh my gosh, Boss Green is suddenly the best deck in the format. It's won every single planetary qualifier. It's top 8 like crazy. I don't think things like that are going to happen. So to start us off, where are we? Well, as you can see, the number 1, number 2, and number 3 decks are Han Yellow, Sabine Green, and Quinlan Red in terms of top 8 positions. Django Red really close up against Quinlan Red, and then Cad Bane not too far behind alongside Bosk Blue. Now, what's interesting about Bosk is we actually have a very, very close split between Bosk Blue and Bosk Green, which are very different styles of decks. If you were to combine the two of them, we have actually 36 total Bosks in the top 8s, which is pretty crazy. For example, if you were to combine Quinlan Green with Quinlan Red, which I believe there's some more Quinlans down here. Yeah, Quinlan Blue. There's even some Bosk Greens. Like, Bosk essentially is a really powerful leader in the top 5. But yeah, Han Yellow, Sabine Green, Quinlan Red, Django Red, Cad Bane Red, and Bosk Blue, the top 6, with a 3 through 5, honestly 3 through 6 decks really kind of closely split, and Han Yellow really pushing ahead, as Han Yellow has 18.5% of the total top 8 meta, Sabine Green having almost 15 at 14.5% of the total meta, Quinlan Red with 9%, and Django Red with 7.7% roughly. So very, very close, and a pretty even split across the board, with Han Yellow and Sabine Green being a little bit of an outlier. But again, 18.5%, 19% of the meta being a single deck or a single archetype, because again, each one of these Han Yellow decks are not the same. There's going to be small variations between the two, but same overall deck, I'd say, with the same tech DJ, the same disruptive elements, etc., 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 isn't too out of the ordinary. And again, I would like to reiterate the fact that for those of you that are saying, oh, maybe this is a little bit too much, I could totally see an argument for that, but it's nowhere near, I think, the banning potential that Boba Fett needed. Okay, Boba Fett was ridiculously dominant. We're talking more than double the percentage of Han Yellow currently is. That is absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd, just with Boba Fett. Now, if you were to include all of the Han decks in the top 8s, which would be kind of a fair comparison, what you'll see is there's a bunch of random ones in here with Han 1. We have 0.26% of security complex Han. We've got 0.53% of Han Tarkintown. We got another 0.53% of Han Blue. We've got another 3 decks of Han Red with 0.79%. And then we've got 9 decks of Han Green. If we were to add all of those up, we are closer to about 24%. Still just under half of, or just over half of the representation that Boba Fett had with the previous set. So definitely not even close to the same dominance. There might be some discussion around, okay, maybe there's some part of this that could be looked at, maybe some sort of change within the deck, but that's really iffy, as at least for me, when we're looking at balance changes, I do not like to alter any physical card in terms of the rules. And so, like, let's say, oh, Han's too strong, so we're going to remove a power from him. He's actually going to be a 3/6, but every printed card says 4/6. Those types of changes, I would never suggest doing, because anytime you receive a card, you don't want it to be different than what the thing you're looking at says. That sounds horrible, and it has happened in the past. So I really, really don't think that's a good plan. I think if you are going to attack Han, it is going to have to be like the way that the rules work for Tech DJ. Like nothing that's printed on the card, but to change how the rules interact with the destroying resources aspect of it and things like that, or actually banning maybe a card element from the deck itself. But that's also a little bit extreme. I think the big thing would be to tackling some of the rules questions, but that's of course a whole conversation for another day. And I personally don't find Han Yellow to be all that worthy of a ban yet. As of number 1 finishes, Han Yellow still taking the cake by far with 13 top finishes. Again, we have total 49 planetary qualifiers. So over a quarter of the number 1 finishes have been Han Yellow. So definitely not only seeing top 8 finishes, but converting into number 1 spots as well. So very good to see. Sabine really hasn't taken anything since like last week. Still sitting at the 6 wins. Boss Green at number 3 with 4. So Boss Green converting extremely nicely. Almost a third of their top 8 decks have actually converted to number 1 finishes. Whereas, as you can see with Han, about 20%, a little bit less than 20% of the top 8 finishes have converted to number 1 spots. Sabine Green actually having a really poor conversion rate, about 10% of their top 8 finishes into number 1 spots. Same with like Quinlan Red, Django Red, Cad Bane Red, all have pretty poor conversion rates as well. But I think the biggest thing is you're seeing a number like 13 winners of Han Yellow, but guess what? You're also seeing all these random decks winning as well. Kira Green, pretty big staple, I think, that a lot of people were expecting. Hasn't really converted all that well in the top 8 so far. As you can see, if you look for like Kira Green, we have like 9 top 8s for them, so reasonable. But we have like Quinlan ECL, Krennic ECL, Cad Blue, Iden Blue, Emp Yellow, Mace Blue, Quinlan Blue, OG Han Blue, Anakin ECL, Yoda Red, and a brand new one in Gar Saxon Yellow. So again, I think the biggest thing is, although we're seeing a lot of top 8s from Han Yellow and we're seeing a lot of number 1 spots, this is most likely due to people view this as the best deck, as I do, and I have been saying for a while. And I think Han Yellow is one of those decks that you really got to be wary of. Same with Sabine Green. Well, people are going to bring it because they expect it to be the best chance that they have. However, it's not so dominant that we're not seeing, again, these random decks. And I've said this many times before in the top 8, even winning the whole tournament, like Gar Yellow. Gar Yellow coming in and actually winning an entire tournament is absolutely nuts. And I actually just started recording a video where I'm just going to be playing this deck and seeing the capabilities of it. And my goodness, in my early matches, it's been pretty strong. It's not like crazy strong. Like it hadn't gotten too many new additions from set 2. But these are the types of decks where you wouldn't expect to win, but because of just the strength of the player and the non-dominance, I guess you could say, of the top decks, you're able to actually take out a win, right? And it's interesting because yes, they're dominant in terms of meta popularity and meta performance, but they're not dominant in terms of actual matchup, right? Like if you're looking at Boba versus some of the other decks in set 2, it would have been like a 75-25% favor towards Boba. Like 75% of the time Boba's going to win. But now you look at some of these matchups, not that I know the matchup percentage of Gar Yellow, but let's say you're fighting Gar Yellow versus Han Yellow. It's not going to be that 75-25% oftentimes. It's more going to be like 60-40, something a lot closer, which means that if you are a skilled player, you can beat the odds. And that's something that's really important to recognize. All of that said, we're going to be talking about some of the top lists as well as the brand new Gar Saxon list. So let's dive into that next. So first off, we've got to talk about Han Yellow. And this one is pretty interesting. I'll say there's been a lot of different modifications over the course of Han Yellow and a lot of different lists coming out. I'll say every single Han Yellow list has the same core. The 3 of DJ, 3 of Tex, 3 of Cunnings. It's got the 2-2 split of Enfys Nest Han Solo generally. It has Plo Koons. It's got Cantina Bouncers and Kiras, and usually in like a 2 of 3 of way. And then it's running the full 3 of Hotshot Blasters. Those are very, very consistent across every single list. Now, the differences come into play in the early game curve mostly. In terms of, are you running C-3POs? This deck is. A lot of decks are running Crafty Smuggler or L3. Are you running Ezra's versus Liberated Slaves, or are you running another card? In this deck, we're running Ezra's, Liberated Slaves, and Rogue Operative all in the same deck, and that's because it has a very interesting addition, which is the Wing Leader. And the idea behind this is you have Ezra, Rogue Operative, C-3PO, and Bodhi as turn 1 options for Wing Leader. That gives you 3, 6, 10 total rebels on turn 1. That's a really nice rebel count for Wing Leader. You deploy one of those 3 or the C-3POs on turn 1 into Wing Leader turn 2, get the experience over them, and that suddenly becomes a very potent threat, especially since a lot of these units are 3-cost units, right? So suddenly, in a normal deck like Sabine, you're going to have a Battlefield Marine turn into a 5-5. And this, Ezra can turn into a 5-6. Rogue Operative can turn into a 4-6 with Raid 2, so a 6-6. Those are crazy stat lines on turn 2, which is really, really interesting to see. So a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more rebel synergy in this. And then we also have the addition of Zori Bliss in this list. This is something that not every deck is playing, but I do think that it can be a little bit interesting, especially since it gives you a little bit more card filtering. And, well, if you kind of look at what you're doing with this, potentially the ability to really get some value out of your smuggle pile. And that is something that a lot of people value. And it makes a lot of sense. If you are in a spot where you're going for the Han Solo 7 turn or 6 turn or whatever it is, Zori Bliss is that perfect amount of cost to be able to use all those 6 resources on those turns where you can't quite get to the 7 resources. And you get a 4/7 body. Like, although it's not an exciting unit, and although the kind of card filtering that you get isn't that exciting either, it is a way to use your resources, and that's something that you really need to do with Han. So that's important to remember. In terms of sideboard, pretty standard stuff. More Han Solos, more Enfys, Bamboozle, Sparks, all standard stuff. But this is the Han Yellow type of list that you're expecting. I think the key parts of this, regardless of the early game and all that stuff, the things that you need to think about when you're fighting Han Yellow: Tech DJ, obviously. This is a really, really, really important thing. If you're able to get rid of the DJ before the end of turn, that really changes the potency of that combination. The second thing is the disruptive elements. Every single Han Yellow is playing things like Kira, Bodhi Rook, Sparks, those types of cards in X amounts. Don't know how much. I don't know if they're even playing all of them, but every deck is running some of those types of cards alongside Cantina Bouncer to really mess up your curve, really mess up your ability to interact. And then you need to be wary of the Han Solo 7 turn alongside Plo Koon, right? So the 7 turn would be Enfys Nest or Han Solo, but then also Plo Koon coming down, still a 6/6 ambusher just like Han Solo, and probably will live any attack. So you need to be wary of all those things when you're fighting Han, and that's a lot of things to remember and play around when you're also getting attacked in your hand and on the board. The next list we got to talk about, I wanted to talk about, Han Yellow is the number 1 deck. But after that, we got Sabine Green in terms of number 1 finishes, which we've all seen. Sabine Green really doesn't change all that much. And to be fair, Han Yellow doesn't change all that much either, but there's a little bit more variety in those lists. Boss Green has the 3rd most Planetary Qualifier top wins. So I figured it's worth talking about because this thing is clearly putting up some results. And again, this is another list that we've seen in the past, and it's a list that really does its same thing over and over and over again, which is I'm going to ramp really hard with resupply, super laser attacks, and price on your heads. And then I'm going to play my massive threats back to back to back to back, and you are going to struggle a lot. If you look, the early game units are few and far between. You're really relying on your early game bounties that you have. 2 death marks, 3 price on your heads, 3 bounty hunters quarries. You also have daring raids. You do have the silencer on turn 1. I think that's more of just really good against a lot of the space decks. On turn 2, that's when we have things like the Sentinels, Dark Trooper, Cell Block Guard. We have the Super Laser Techs, the punishing ones. all solid plays. We completely skipped the 4 resource turn because we're planning on getting to 5 resources so that we can deploy Bossk and use a bunch of these things like Overwhelming Barrage. But also, Bounty Hunter's Quarry, you really want a nice selection of 3 or less drops to be able to really work well with that card. Same with Darth Vader. And so all these cards you'll notice have villainy tags in the 3 drop slot, and 2 of them have Sentinel. There's a reason why a lot of people are playing the full 3 of Phase 3 Darks and the Cell Block card, and that's because if you're able to avoid the early game aggression that people have, both in the space and ground arenas, you are going to completely overwhelm them with Darth Vaders, Mauls, Walkers, Palps, Crate Dragons, Ruthless Raiders, etc., etc., etc. I think this is really, really a sweet list to look at, because it's one of the lists that I find to be most enjoyable. And one of the things that's completely dumb is getting a Bossk down and being able to double claim Bounty Hunter's Quarry, where you have, okay, I'm going to grab a Punishing one and a Phase 3 Dark Trooper. So I have a Sentinel and I have a Punishing one that's probably going to kill one of your space units that you have. Or I'm going to grab a Super Laser Technician, maybe double Super Laser Technician. I've gotten that before. And suddenly, next turn, I'm going to be on 8 resources. So as early as, since you probably ramped before this, as early as turn 3, I get my Bossk down, double claim, get 2 Super Laser Technicians. Turn 4, I'm putting Palpatine into play. Palpatine into play. That's absolutely absurd, right? That is very, very common, especially with Price on your head as well, because you can double claim Price on your heads to where you get to Darth Vader's and Mauls the following turn that Bossk comes down. So Bossk come down, you double claim Price in your head, you got Mauls, you got Vaders, you got Reinforcement Walkers you could potentially play, and heck, you could even do this on that turn. Like turn 1, you play Price on your head or Bounty Hunter's Quarry. Maybe it's a Price on your head, you just ping, right? Turn 2, you play your Super Laser Technician. Okay, not that big of a deal. Turn 3, you kill your Super Laser Technician by attacking one of their units. You get to Bossk. Remember, at this point, you're continuously pinging. Maybe you kill a unit or you sacrifice your Super Laser Technician into another unit. You flip Bossk. You attack the unit that has Price on your head. You double claim. You get to play a Darth Vader that turn. As early as turn 3, you are playing Darth Vaders. That is absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. And that's what this deck does. And that's the reason why it's performing well, is you just have so much ramp, so many explosive abilities in Bounty Hunter's Quarry, Price on your head, flooding the board with a bunch of 3 drops, or going really big really quickly, and then adding the fact that you have the Overwhelming Barrage and the ability to draw a bunch of cards with Deathmark. This deck really attacks on a lot of angles, and I think it's really worth trying if you haven't already. But then we've got the list that I wanted to talk about as well, and that is the Gar Saxon Yellow here. And this is a really, really awesome list, and something that I've gotten to play with a lot over the past couple of days. As I mentioned, I was recording a video for. But this is basically the same Gar Saxon Yellow list that I had played in set 2 in terms of strategy and overall strength. I was playing Dr. Evazon's Crafty Smugglers, 7th Fleet Defenders, Super Commando Squads. Basically, anyone that was playing Gar Saxon Yellow realized that this was going to be a good thing, right? It's not like I was specifically thinking about this, all this stuff, but anyone could see, oh, Crafty Smuggler with a shield turns into a 3-2 shielded with Gar Saxon. Evazon is a 4-3 shielded. 7th Fleet, 4-2 shielded. Your Super Commando Squad is a 5-4 shielded Sentinel, right? That is really strong. Client, 3-5 shielded. All those things are really, really powerful. You just get good units, and you kind of dominate the early game with your opponent not being able to interact because you have the shields, which is really strong. But then you also get your kind of upgrades. You get your Hotshot Blasted, which turns into +3 power oftentimes. Snapshot Reflexes, which turns into +2/+1 with an attack because of Gar Saxon. And then you have the Mach Clunky with all the Underworld cards. You're playing the full 3 of Breaking Ins to get that Saboteur. And you're just kind of like this aggro deck, which is really, really strong. But you're not really an aggro deck in the traditional sense. You're an aggro deck by really dominating the early game because of your shield tokens, and then you pump up your units with these random small upgrades that are really cheap to really dominate your opponent. And it's a really, really powerful list. Now, I can't really say too much about how all of the matchups go. All I know is there's a lot of kind of minor synergies in this deck. And in set 3, you're only getting the Breaking Ins and Perilous Positions as new cards. Everything, oh, and the Cad Bane, I should say. But you're really only getting those 2 cards because Cad Bane doesn't really come down all that often. But you really have the same list as you would have been playing from set 2. It's just that the way the game is shaped up with Tarkin Town being so dominant, well, your shields are really massive. And if they don't have an immediate damage ping to the shield tokens, then you'll just dominate their early game with your more impressive shielded units. And on top of that, if they do have a damage ping to one of your units, it's probably just going to either hit their shielded token or unit, or maybe not even trade, because their units are small. Like if Django goes ISB agent, get rid of your shield, you're still left with a 2/2 crafty smuggler, and it can become like a 4/3 with snapshot reflexes, and that can be really, really powerful. So definitely a sweet list and really awesome to see. And I do think it has some really strong aspects for it. The card, as I mentioned in my previous version of Garsaxa Yellow, that really impressed me is Snapshot Reflexes. Being +2/+1 with an attack is basically like a better surprise strike, I found, because it gives you a permanent buff. It gets you that immediate attack, and it gives you close to the amount of power because of Garsaxan. It is really, really strong. So good stuff with this list, and another one that I think is worth checking out if you haven't. But that's more of a fun one. The other two are more just solid ones that we've been seeing. And as I mentioned, these are the types of lists that you're going to see a lot of, right? Not Garsaxan, but Han Yellow, Sabine Green, Quinlan Red. These three are going to be lists that you need to face and you need to be prepared for. And I will note, if you look at the top 5, at least percentages of decks, we have a tempo deck, straight up tempo. We have Sabine Green, which is more of like an aggro / mid-range deck. I would say it attacks on both angles, but definitely an aggro deck. We have Quinlan Red, which is more of an aggro tempo deck, kind of like a mix there. Django, which is an aggro tempo deck, and Cad Bane, which is an aggro tempo deck. All of these kind of fit under the same style. So definitely something that we should be considering as the meta has developed. There seems to be way more of a focus towards aggressive, focused decks. And that's something that we really need to make sure that is something that we think about, because I know a lot of people are already kind of frustrated about that. Things like Anakin Blue, things like Palp Yellow, things like Ray Red, or these types of decks. Well, these are decks that really, really get ran over oftentimes because of the strength of these top 5 lists. And we were seeing in set 2 a pretty big split. Like we had your Boba decks, we had or not necessarily big split, but big split outside of Boba. We were seeing a lot of different decks try to compete, like Sabine with the aggro aspect, we had the boss with the controlling aspect. Boba just completely dominated, so it made everything a little bit silly. But perhaps because of the Boba ban, all these really aggressive decks, there's no one to compete with. You either need to be aggressive or disruptive on your own element, or you need to just go ahead and have your like Boba list where you can really have this overstated leader alongside all these resource resets to be able to come back in the game. Now, that's not to say that these are completely out of meta. Like nothing else can compete in terms of like Bossk Blue still is doing well, Boss Green is still doing well, Anakin Blue is still doing well, but it certainly is a lot fewer percentage points in terms of the overall meta that are outside of the aggro tempo style. So just something to think about as we go into the deeper parts of planetary qualifiers. And of course, we're going to be reviewing it at the end of set 3, but maybe with the future of set 4, hopefully we'll see a little bit more diversity in the overall archetypes. While there are decks that can compete still, the meta in terms of popular decks isn't as diverse. And I think that's mainly because people view these as better decks. And that just might be like the people's opinion versus what it actually is. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for a video tomorrow.